Hey, it's Snake. A while back I saw this really funny YouTube short that had 5 of these ridiculous meme planes in it. And I thought to myself, you know what? I haven't played Kerbal Space Program in ages, and that game lets you build all sorts of hideous abominations. Why not try to recreate these planes in Kerbal Space Program? Also, it turns out there's an entire series of these shorts where some of the abominations get even more ridiculous. Thank the Archons I didn't decide to recreate any of those. But anyway, we've got a lot of footage to go through, so let's just get right to it. The first of the planes is the Boeing 7.3, and this was honestly probably the easiest build out of all of them. I just had to take all of the standard diameter parts and just make a plane that was short and stubby and just had all the tiniest components possible. I was a little bit concerned about the center of lift being so far behind the center of mass, but it turned out to not matter too much in the end, and I got a plane that could fly. However, at the end of the test flight, unfortunately, it did not have the smoothest landing. But all in all, building the Boeing 7.3 was fairly easy. And it gave me confidence that I still had some semblance of knowing what I was doing with this game. However, this is where that confidence would be shattered, because the next plane was the Airbus A420. The Airbus A420 presents a number of logistical issues, not the least of which is the fact that it consists of 7 airplane fuselages strapped together side by side. Immediately, my first concern was the fact that this plane would be absurdly heavy, and that did turn out to be a problem. Even with 4 of the airliner engines underneath the wings, I could not get the thing to fly, even after it went off the end of the runway. It would just go onto the ground and straight into the ocean. Somehow, all the fuselages survived though, which I found quite surprising. Eventually, I decided I was just going to change the engines out for more powerful ones. I built my own little hardpoints on the underside of the wing and then attached these afterburning turbofans, which ideally should have gotten more power. And now, instead of 4 engines, I was going to have 8 of them. However, this Airbus A420 still did not want to fly, even with 8 afterburning turbojet engines on it. So then I thought to myself, what other things do really big planes use to take off when their engines alone can't get them off the runway? Well, the C-130 Hercules has rocket-assisted takeoff, so why not put some solid rocket boosters on it? This is our first flight with the rocket-assisted takeoff, and yeah, the results were about the same. However, when the plane bounced off the ground right before the ocean, it did achieve some semblance of flight, only to immediately splash down right after that. But this did give me a feeling that I was going in the right direction. I tried draining some of the liquid fuel from the fuselage to make the plane lighter so that it would be more likely to fly, and then I also tried attaching just bigger solid rocket boosters for the rocket-assisted takeoff. At this point, I was completely stumped on what to do. I had more powerful jet engines, bigger rocket boosters for the rocket-assisted takeoff, so I just gave up and decided to make this thing look less like a plane and I dragged the wings forward to move the center of lift closer to the center of mass. And as you can see, with the wings moved all the way forward, this thing looks dumb as hell. But now, when I throttle up, turn the afterburners on, and fire the rocket-assisted takeoff, it reaches the end of the runway, and it actually flies. The Airbus A420 is now airborne. It doesn't fly very well, mind you. I have to keep the stick pulled back at all times, but it flies. It also turns, but not very well, as you might be able to imagine for a plane with 7 fuselages strapped to each other. And now it was time to bring this test flight to an end and come in for landing. I thought I had a decent vertical velocity on this thing, but it turns out when you have this much mass flying at once, yeah, the impact forces get amplified a significant amount. We definitely did not make it in one piece, but hey, we made it. And look, 2 of the other fuselages survived as well. So now it was time for airplane number 3, the Boeing Big Wheels. I started by just building a fairly standard airplane with the airliner engines and everything. And now that we have a beautiful passenger airliner, it's time to ruin it with big wheels. These are the biggest wheels in the base game of Kerbal Space Program, so those were the ones I was going to work with. Then for the front landing gears, I was going to add some slightly smaller wheels, but they're still bigger than the regular airplane landing gears. And thankfully, from one update to Kerbal Space Program, these wheels can actually withstand being spun really fast now. In previous versions of the game, you would absolutely not be able to do this. The wheels would just break the moment you went too fast. Construction of the Boeing Big Wheels is complete, and now it is time for the test flight. It took getting to the end of the runway, but once it was off the ground, it stayed off the ground. Thank goodness I didn't have to continue this one for too long. I was already starting to lose my mind by this point because, I mean, just look at how ridiculous this thing is. I did go back to the spaceplane hangar though because I realized I forgot to put control surfaces on the wings. So I kind of needed to take care of that. And now, with the control surfaces on the wings, we have a working Boeing Big Wheels. It, once again, does not fly very well. I don't think any of these meme planes are supposed to, but it flies. And that's good enough for me. So now it was time to come in for landing. I had no idea how this would go because the rover wheels can withstand pretty high speeds, but I wasn't sure if they could withstand hard impacts. And it turns out one of the front wheels exploded, while the other just completely broke. I took one of the Kerbals out to try and fix it while the plane was on the move, but then I realized I forgot to apply the brakes. So I switched back to control the plane, applied the brakes, and then my Kerbal fell off and died on impact with the ground. And then I activated the brakes too late, so the plane just went smashing into this hill. Still, I would call that a successful Boeing Big Wheels. As successful as it can get, anyway. Plane number 2. The original short just calls this the Boeing What The, but I call it the Boeing Centipede. I was originally going to use the larger airliner fuselage for this, but then I realized because the wheels look so big in the original short, it would actually be a better sense of scale to use the smaller fuselages for this one. There's also the fact that the plane has giant delta wings, which wouldn't really look proportional if I were to build them out of the wing pieces using the larger fuselage, so that was another reason to get the sense of scale across. So now with the wings assembled, it was time for the main attraction. I was just going to put a giant line of landing gears on the undercarriage of the plane, and it should reasonably be able to take off and land, I think. And now this plane needs engines. I had a feeling this plane was going to be pretty heavy, so I used the turbo ramjets for this one. Not really realistic on a passenger plane, but were any of these planes ever going to be realistic in the first place? I think it's fine. Of course, I had to make the engines extra long also to fit the Boeing Centipede. And now we are ready for our test flight. And I managed to get the Boeing Centipede to fly on my first try, which was a surprising but welcome development. I wasn't gonna spend too much time on this thing. Now that I think about it, it looks almost like the Concorde. A plane in Kerbal Space Program with these ramjet engines can go pretty fast, so I was considering seeing how fast it could go, but I realized this would be kind of a fool's errand because it was taking forever to accelerate to any sort of respectable speed. So I just decided to see how the plane turns and then bring it in for landing. And with that, we have the first successful landing of all of our test flights with the Boeing Centipede of all the planes. I was honestly not expecting this, but I had a feeling this would be the last successful landing of our test flights, because now it's time to get to the number one plane, the Boeing Uniwheel. Oh boy, this plane was an absolute nightmare to build. First, I just started by building a smaller plane because the wheel on the original Boeing Uniwheel is absolutely huge. So once again, I built a smaller plane so that I could fit the proportionally bigger wheel on the underside. And now we have a perfectly nice looking plane, and once again, it is time to ruin it. So the way I was going to do this was to have two of the biggest rover wheels intersecting each other so that they would end up looking like one wheel. So I put two of them on, rotated them around a bit, and translated them until they were sort of clipping into each other. And yeah, that looks dumb as hell, but I had hopes that it would actually fly. And as soon as we hit the runway, we see the first problem, which was that I forgot to turn off same vessel interaction. The second problem is also quite apparent, and that is that standing the plane on one wheel is not stable by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't want to have to do this, but I had a feeling in the back of my mind that I was going to need to add a launch clamp. Now that we've got a launch clamp, here's the plan. We fire the engines up, let them spool up to max thrust, and then as soon as they're there, release the launch clamp and let the plane fly. But of course, as fate would have it, this didn't work. The plane was unbalanced and just ended up dragging its tail along, and then I thought I was getting somewhere as it began to pick up speed, only for it to start to fall apart again. And as soon as the plane has its nose in the ground like this, it's just not recovering from that, so I had to revert and do some additional tweaking. I wasn't going to move the wheels back because at that point they would actually just get in the way of the engines and not allow any thrust to come out. But I decided to turn back to my old solution from the Airbus A420 to get this thing airborne, which was rocket-assisted takeoff. Of course, this being a smaller plane, we need to add smaller rockets, but I was hoping this would work, so then I wouldn't have to deal with this any longer. I'd already been playing this game for an hour just doing this ridiculous shit, and I was ready to edit this footage down. We now had added rocket-assisted takeoff, and now with the rocket-assisted takeoff added, we were running into the same problem. In fact, the tail got destroyed, followed by the entire rest of the plane after that. But hey, Valentina survived. At this point, I wasn't sure what to do. If I tried to cram more thrust onto the plane, then it would just end up looking like a ridiculous abomination. I could have maybe tried to put bigger rocket boosters on it, but that probably would have just sent it spiraling even faster. I did raise the launch clamp to give it some air, so that hopefully it would actually sort of glide to the ground and get a flying start once the launch clamp was released. And I also turned off the motors on the wheels to give myself as much forward velocity as I could if the plane happened to touch the ground. And it was at this point that myself from the future realized the potential problem. The wheels were a lot heavier than I was expecting, and they were just not allowing the plane to fly. Even with a rocket-assisted takeoff, those tiny wings were just not providing any lift to get it off the ground. According to all known laws of aviation, there is no way the Boeing Uniwheel should be able to fly. I moved the engines around to try and give them a bit more clearing for the thrust output to work, but that did not solve the problem either. And after continuing with some more tweaks, I just gave up. I was already losing my mind trying to build these meme planes in Kerbal Space Program, and I did not realize at the time that I probably just didn't have enough lift to get those giant wheels off the ground. So, unfortunately, the Boeing Uniwheel was not going to work. But with all that said, here is that original YouTube short recreated in Kerbal Space Program. That's about it. Thanks for watching, everyone. I will talk to you all later.
time.